Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another amazing Saturday session, day 8, right, of Surah An-Nisa. So this has been an incredible journey. We're, I think, starting at verse 101, or we left off at verse 101 last time. So I'm so excited to continue because every single halakha is just so deep and rich with meaning. It's incredible. And once again, I have to highlight the incredible khutbah yesterday, which again, it's like it just gets better and better. And yesterday's was particularly amazing because it focused on something just so basic but so important that often is left unsaid, and it's the idea of trust and belief. Iman. Like if you're iman, you say you're a believer, then that implies that you have a level of trust, that you trust what God is telling you, and that you trust that the things that God says, or that what we know about God is actually true. And we never actually take a moment to really think about the implication of that and what that means if we genuinely, truly trust. And it was such a powerful khutbah. It's one of these kinds of things where Sheikh has a really amazing ability to tell you things, like point out things that are hidden in plain sight, right? That you never really think about. But when you actually look at them and you think about them, you recognize how profound they are. And something as simple as, if you say you're a believer, then that means that you really should trust what God tells you. But oftentimes it's clear when you start thinking about it that maybe I don't really act in a way that would engender trust or would communicate that I truly, truly trust. And so it's such a powerful question that calls each and every one of us to turn internally, look inward and ask ourselves, do we actually trust? And what does that mean? And what do we do? So it's, that was incredible. And also, there in the second khutbah, he actually addressed a question that I got recently. And we actually hear this, a lot of times. Sometimes people will say, this sheikh, he just stands up and he just complains and talks about all the things that are wrong, and oftentimes will leave us feeling sort of depressed or down, not really quite knowing what to do, as if the implication is it's in our personal hands to change the world, which obviously we can only do so much. But he sort of addressed that question in a very powerful way, and what we should and can do about our own intention and our own desire, and how God really understands the truth of what's within us, and if we are worthy of changing what's within us, then maybe God will help us. So, but if we're going to continue to deny or not want to listen to what's wrong with us, or what is hard to hear about our community, if we want to pretend that things are all okay, then we're really lying to ourselves and to the world and to God ultimately. And so, there's some really powerful questions that Sheikh poses in the khutbah. And so this was truly a mind twister, and something that I think it's just really requires a lot of reflection. So he answers, I think the thing that I wanted to say generally is, we oftentimes get this question, like, what are we supposed to do? Like a lot of times we get hopeless and we talk about all the things that are wrong with the Muslim community. And this actually, it's like Sheikh actually tells us, he answers these questions, because here we are talking about, one, understanding, what is our relationship with God? Do we trust? How does that impact how we act in the world at large? And then what do we know about the world? How do we engage it? How is our level of education? Do we know our tradition? Are we, being true to what our tradition calls us for? And then when we are told, like in these educational khutbah sessions, because I really consider them sort of like your weekly education lecture that tells you about the world, because, like we learned about things that I've never heard of before, trust indexes, like a nonprofit grant that you can apply for millions of dollars to preserve, if you think that you're under attack. These are things that Muslims need. And if you didn't listen to the khutbah, please do, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But things that you're just not aware of. And then it ultimately comes back to like, okay, change what's in your heart so we can start to change ourselves so that God can help us change everything. It's like people want to know, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And Sheikh is answering that question. A lot of times we don't really want to hear the answer. Maybe we don't want to put it all together. Maybe we realize that it's harder than it actually, than just like sitting and wishing that things are going to be better. But all the answers are here. And so that, I think, really hit home hard with me yesterday. And so it's difficult to hear sometimes, but it's ultimately very liberating. And so I really want to encourage you guys to watch it, read the summary, and reflect, inshallah, and pray for Sheikh, because I feel like you can't really get these answers anywhere else. And it's really encouraging. It's a really comforting thing when you even hear the truth that's difficult to hear, but you feel it's true, and there's a beauty and a cleansing in that. Secondly, I just wanted to call your attention to, last week when we were here, I mentioned that I was going to be having a conversation with my friend Cameron Lee, who has been fighting cancer since 2016. And we actually did have the conversation last Sunday. It's up now on YouTube. And it was a really, really powerful conversation. I felt very grateful that, even though Cameron, he's 38 years old, he has had cancer he had cancer in colon cancer, stage 3. He was diagnosed with that back in 2016, had chemo, was declared to be in remission, and then the cancer came back and it spread to other parts of his body. And then recently he got the diagnosis, or he was told that he pretty much had about a month to live, maybe a little bit more. I was really grateful when he agreed to just have a conversation about just life and death and things like that. And so it was really amazing. And the thing is, it's, these things are hard to watch, because certainly it's, hard to be reminded, but I think they're also very powerful. And one of the things that I wanted to just, in case people really don't have the time to watch, one of the things that was really amazing that tied back to what we're learning here is he actually shared a dream that he had of his death, and what it was like for, the angels to literally pull the soul out of his body. But also with that, something that we covered in Surah Al-Jathiyah, which was the second surah that we did in the Project Illumine series, which is where we learned about this idea of, when your hands or your body will testify against you on the final day. Oftentimes we sort of feel like, like what, your hands and your feet are going to like develop lips and, testify against you. Well, no. So what we learned from Surah Al-Jathiyah is it's like you on the final day will see your actions, your sins, the things that you committed that were, bad, and also the things that you did that were good, and that these are the things that you would be held accountable for. And subhanAllah, in his dream, he actually had that experience where it was like the angels were walking with him, and he described it as a museum where he had to, witness his own misdeeds. So it's a really powerful discussion that, for those of us, I think, who have been learning, all of this that we've been learning in the Quran, it was an amazing sort of like, oh my God, that's exactly what we learned. So, if for nothing else, I think these conversations are a really stark reminder of what's important, and help you give you perspective on how precious life is, how meaningful life is, and ultimately, how short of a time we have on this earth. And, it's a really beautiful reminder to make your time count, and think about your legacy that you're going to leave behind. And so I was very grateful to have that opportunity to talk with Cameron. And again, I'm really grateful. He was not feeling well and he was tired, but he was really articulate and smart. And if nothing else, I thought at the very beginning I read the very first email that he sent us, and also Sheikh's response, and that was really powerful. So if you don't really have time to watch the whole thing, which was over an hour, even if you just watch the first 10 minutes, that was an incredible education in itself. So highly encourage you to do that. And then last thing is, in terms of heavy events, we have one more event coming a week from tomorrow, March 20th, Sunday, from 4 to 6 in the afternoon. It's a Zoom conversation. It's a Q&A. Sorry? It's not tomorrow, a week from tomorrow. Sorry, a week from tomorrow, March 20th, at 4 o'clock, and it's going to be on Zoom. And so we are going to be covering I think, some really important questions that have to do with spiritual and sexual abuse at the hands of religious authority, what we as individuals and as a community, are responsible for, what we should do, how we can be proactive to help people, help victims, what's our responsibility in terms of speaking out. And I think a lot of people have a lot of these same questions. There's a lot of confusion, and so hopefully we can dispel a lot of these myths. And so I really encourage you to join. If you can't join the live stream, as always, we will record it, and so you can watch it afterwards as well. So a lot of really great stuff happening. Alhamdulillah, I'm so grateful that this. We cover a lot of topics that are difficult, but I feel like these are the things that are really important, that make a difference, and that you really can't find in a lot of other Muslim spaces. So I hope that you will share it with your friends, and inshallah, I'm looking forward to another amazing session tonight with Surah An-Nisa. Thank you for joining us. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Just a very quick appeal that I forgot to make. I'm wondering if anyone lives anywhere near Sterling, Virginia, and has a sweet dog. From my conversation with Cameron over the years, he's always wished he could have a dog. And there's nothing that would, I think, he didn't ask for this, but I thought it would be really wonderful if someone knew anyone or lives somewhere near Sterling, Virginia, and might be willing to just bring a dog over for a visit. So that, I think it would mean a lot. We actually, I had some help in trying to track down whether it would be possible to find a therapy dog, but unfortunately, because of insurance reasons, therapy dogs cannot visit people at home. So now we're kind of left with the idea, if anyone has, a wonderful dog and would like to earn some hasanat, please get in contact with me. I think it would really be special. So thank you so much.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Subhanallah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa mittaba'u bi ihsanin ila yawm ad-din. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. We sorry for the delay. There were some technical difficulties or something like that. Okay, Bismillah. It is important to remember that Surah An-Nisa, in so many ways, it's demonstrative ethics, because the entire surah walks us through, on the one hand, historical incidentals. So on the one hand, it is talking about actual historical challenges that confronted the Muslim Ummah at the time, but the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deals with these challenges and addresses these challenges demonstrates ethical points. And as we saw in our journey, that we even get to the point where several foundational principles are laid out in the context of addressing historical incidentals. The sanctity of life and the absolute prohibition against a Muslim killing another, and the severe consequences of taking this lightly, and at the same time, as we saw, that even when it comes to dealing with those who are antagonistic to the Muslim nation, even when it comes to dealing with non-Muslims, the warning not to take that peace is a gift, and the niyat salam, one having an intention of peaceful relations with Muslims is a blessing from Allah, and not to take that lightly. And then, as we saw, this then leads to, again, this duality of a historical, incidental, historical context, the context of people who converted to Islam but were not strong enough to make the decision that is mandated of them. But the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deals with this results in a penultimate, again, foundational principle about disempowerment and about the very purpose of what causes you must commit yourself to vindicate. That the qital, the warfare, its just cause is to remove the condition of disempowerment, to remove the condition of istid'af. The later Muslims, especially in the modern age, who took this and matched it or wedded it to liberation theology, it's very logical. I mean, because it is, in modern parlance, a very, very much a liberation theology type discourse. But at the same time, the issue of disempowerment is not just dealt with as the external aspect of disempowerment, but also the internal aspect of disempowerment. To what extent are you complicit in your own disempowerment? And this is, I mean, if you read this as a technocrat, as someone who is interpreting positive law, you miss the larger ethical point, because the myopic, positivistic, legalistic approach would simply ask the question of, well, if I am oppressed, can I travel? And if and the only question becomes, the technicalities of, can I escape my oppression by relocating elsewhere? But the larger ethical point is all the ways that you are complicit in your own disempowerment. So when we find that Sufis, for instance, read the same text, and of course Sufis are not so interested in the aspect of political disempowerment, but the way that they take this entire narrative is as, whether you perform internal hijrah, whether you can migrate with your soul towards the Allah's sovereignty, towards the pastures of the divine, rather than remain locked in you. They come closer to the spirit. Not saying that they fulfill the spirit, but they come closer to the spirit, because clearly the demonstrative treatment of the historical example is to pose the question that all of us are obligated to ask ourselves: in what ways are we complicit in our own disempowerment, in our own state of oppression? And it bears emphasis that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then notes, وَمَنْ يُهَاجِرْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ يَجِدْ فِي الْأَرْضِ مُرَاغَمًا كَثِيرًا وَسِعًا, that migration, that sacrifice, the resistance to resisting your own complicity in your own disempowerment, or seeking to throw off the shackles of disempowerment. The muragham is, as we noted last halaqah, is a difficulty and loneliness. And the expectation, and again, if you take the Sufi discourses, they often talk about how when you commit yourself to migrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it is a road that no one can accompany you in. That it is a truly a journey that you and you alone can take. But again, beyond the Sufi tendency to take everything as a form of spiritual liberation, the understanding, which if it's remarkable that again the Quran is dealing with historical challenges, and if you understand reform in history, change in history, the way that reform and change occur in history, it is instigated in so many examples. Reform is always instigated by individuals who go against the grain and who in fact pursue very lonely roads. It is as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, expect challenges and difficulties and expect loneliness. And of course, Allah's ease is mixed in with the challenges. The purification of intentionality is core to this entire thing, because as long as your intent is in the right place, then all the difficulties, all the challenges, all the jihad is worth it. It is directed, anchored correctly. Okay. So all of this is just a recap. Now, remarkably, after we get this revolutionary statement about the fact that one can be a Muslim and still one can convert to Islam and can still exist and allow himself or herself to exist in an unethical, to allow themselves to persist in an unethical existence, and the demand that you resist istidaf and that you reject istidaf, what does it go on to talk about right after that? And the answer is, as it narrows in on microdynamics of what to do at a micro level when you are confronted with practical difficulties in pursuit of this larger cause. So, وإذا ضربتم في الأرض فليس عليكم جناح أن تقصروا من الصلاة إن خفتم أن يفتنكم الذين كفروا إن الكافرين كانوا لكم عدوا مبينا. وإذا كنت فيهم فأقمت لهم الصلاة فلتقم طائفة منهم معك وليأخذوا أسلحتهم فإذا سجدوا فليكونوا من ورائكم. So this is from 101 to 102 to 103. First, the practical ruling about shortening prayer, al-qasr fi salah, in case of fear or in a state of war where you are afraid of the enemy. And the very micro level pragmatic advice, to put it bluntly, it's like saying, and the advice here is very common sense. Use your common sense. Don't use the excuse of religious doctrine to justify dogmatic behavior. So don't all go pray at one time and render yourself vulnerable before your enemy. And even it offers this very practical, pragmatic advice that when you pray, a group stands guard and a group prays, and when you pray, don't put your weapons down, pray with your weapons. If you pause at this and you think, so how did we get from the high ethical advice or this broader moral principle to dealing with this very micro level pragmatic details of the do's and don'ts? And again, if you only pay attention to the positivistic, legalistic aspects of this, and so you read these ayat and you say, oh, well, okay, so it's telling me that I can do qasr when in a state of jihad, when there is fear, and then it's saying that, a group stands guard and a group prays. You can render all of this into just simple positivistic rules, but I think you would miss the point. It's like saying, Allah is fully aware that these larger moral causes cannot be approached unless you navigate through a whole set of practical challenges. And for me, these ayat, because what they say, on the one hand, is very practical and even common sense. But for me, it is like giving you, not license, but ordering you to use your common sense in pursuit of the larger cause. So, don't use, it's like, don't perform your prayers stupidly. Don't perform your prayers in a way that would ultimately contribute to victimizing you or turning you into victims, to contribute in your own disempowerment. The larger point that you get from this, it is not about a group prays carrying its weapons and a group watches. It is about the technicalities of the law should never be an excuse for defeating the larger cause. You don't just simply say, well, right now we are going through a state of darura, so just forget the technicalities. So forget all the micro demands. You don't do that. You don't take that lightly. But at the same time, you are duty bound to think very carefully about how the legal commands, the positive law, must be yielded in a way that maximizes service for the objectives. If you read the earliest texts on usul al-fiqh, for instance, of course, the obvious example is a Risala by Shafi'i. It is clear that the people who dealt and thought through the principles of usul al-fiqh were in fact executing, but within the epistemology of their time, within the logic and systems of knowledge of their time, the way that they understood the ethical dynamics of the Quranic texts to work out. We don't do that because we don't read the Quran that closely. We don't develop a relationship with the Quran that is intimate and that close. And take the Quran as an integral, coherent text in its entirety. Now, so that is the pragmatic aspect. But what is also noteworthy here, and what deserves a bit of a pause, فإذا قضيتم الصلاة فاذكروا الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبكم. This is 103. فإذا اطمأننتم فأقيموا الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. After the legalistic solutions or navigating through the technicalities in order to think through what the threats are and how I can respond to these threats while not further disempowering myself, while not making myself vulnerable. What is the advice that Allah gives us? Allah anchors this in a larger principle. The remembrance of Allah standing or sitting or lying down. If this is a struggle in Allah's cause, then for someone to wage a jihad in Allah's cause, they cannot be thinking about the spoils of war. They cannot be thinking about the prestige. They cannot be thinking about the remembrance of Allah. And remember that Allah is the ultimate shahid, is the ultimate witness. And Allah knows if, as a people, when you claim your jihad, you proclaim it in terms of ideological principles, but your spirit is empty of the divine, or in fact, your spirit is full of the divine, And so, and not a lot of people posit this, that it sort of tells you, once you figure out the technicalities, remember that all of this, these technicalities are not their own purpose. The purpose is the constant remembrance of Allah in every state of being, regardless of the technicalities. It's not about, whether you're standing up or you're lying down or you're sitting or you're doing qasr or you're watching the people who are praying or you're standing guard or it is that you are consistently exist with Allah. And again emphasizing, and if the exceptional exigent circumstance end, restore again. So فإذا اطمأننتم فأقيموا الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. That this relationship with Allah through dhikr and prayer is so essential that Allah's advice about, okay, so what do we do when we're done praying under exigent circumstances? The answer is, well, do prayer under normal circumstances. Allah couldn't have emphasized the critical importance of being in a state of prayer and being in a state of dhikr with Allah constantly. This is a little bit of a digression, but not a major digression. If we are truly, how do I put this? Okay. A pristine state of Iman is that you are in a state of tranquility and serenity with the remembrance of Allah. Now, so I remember Allah, whether I do it in the form of iqamat as-salah, I'm actually praying rak'at, or I am in a state of dhikr, and I would feel fulfilled, and I would feel that my loneliness is not just manageable, but could even become pleasurable. Why? Because I'm accompanied by Allah. My companion is Allah. Moreover, in a state of dhikr and prayer, the earthly difficulties and challenges do not become overwhelming, because again, your constant safe zone or zones of safety is your being accompanied by the divine. When do we sin? We don't normally sin when we are in a state of dhikr. We sin when the dhikr is silenced. So even if I read a horrible story yesterday about in Pakistan, a Quran teacher who sexually assaults a girl and murders her. Although this is a Quran teacher, but ask yourself this question. How long did the state of dhikr end with this man before he was capable, as a Quran teacher, to rape a girl and murder her. This man, although Quran teacher, it is absolutely for certain that dhikr had been silenced in this man's heart and mind for a very long time. Silenced for such a long time that shaitan came and inhabited and filled the space, as Surah An-Nisa will tell us in a second. So, when we commit all types of sins, when we commit ghaiba, as Surah An-Nisa talks about, we find ourselves drawn to talking about people, slandering people. When we are filled with anger or resentment about this person or that person, when we experience jealousy towards this person or that person, when we find ourselves pulled to things like, in our modern age, pornography, and that whole thing, it is not because you are fulfilled with dhikr, but it is because either you no longer, or for periods of time, no longer the dhikr doesn't resonate within you, or you've silenced the dhikr long enough to commit the sin. So, when Allah reminds us in this what happens under the exigencies of war, confronted with violence and hardship and pain and ugliness, dhikr is often silenced within people. Dhikr is often silenced. And that is why Allah underscores that it is in fact, when you are confronted with these situations where you are truly challenged, when there is extreme hardship, this is the time where you need the dhikr the most. This is a really important concept that we don't raise generations of Muslims have not been raised on this. The closer you find company and comfort and serenity in Allah's dhikr, the more you fill the space of your spirit with Allah's dhikr, the less you will have the space for other things, unbecoming things, things that are not worthy of you as a human being. The more your heart is emptied of dhikr, the more these things will creep in. Whether you want it or not, they literally creep in like an abandoned home becomes full of dust and cobwebs. I mean, it just is. And it is not, no one is born, because we've been given an intellect. We're not like animals and plants who are constantly supplicating Allah, but we just don't understand their supplication. Human beings, because they've been given an intellect and they've been given a choice, whether dhikr in fact gives you that type of companionship depends on the sum total of decisions you make in life. I mean, this is a silly example, but no one is born knowing how to play video games. How good you are in video games depends on how much you invest in it. And same thing with dhikr. And I'm not saying, it doesn't need to be an official wird. It doesn't need to be an official zikr cycle. But it is, if you will notice, if you are actually conscious of yourself, you will notice that every time before you commit a sin, you silence dhikrullah inside of yourself. You silence it long enough to commit your sin. If you are intent on not sinning, then it is enough for you to say, I commit myself to not silence dhikrullah inside of myself for whatever the excuse. And you'll see the results. You'll see the difference it makes. 104 is a ayah that is often cited and had an enormous influence on Islamic culture. You just wish that Muslims would actually remember it more often. وَلَا تَهِنُوا فِي ابْتِغَاءِ الْقَوْمِ. So Muhammad, as it says, and be not faint of heart when you seek out the enemy host. Okay, so that's clear enough, right? وإن تكونوا تعلمون فإنهم يعلمون كما تعلمون وترجون من الله ما لا يرجون وكان الله عليما حكيما. So if you suffer pain, keep in mind, remember that they suffer pain as you suffer pain. And you, however, hope to receive from God what they cannot hope to receive from God. This goes to the very psychology of jihad. Why do I say it? It plays a big role in Islam, in Islamic culture. As often struggles, it's a matter of perseverance and who is willing to persevere the most when confronted with sacrifices. And to in fact internalize and remember that if you just focus on your own sacrifices and your own pains and ignore the fact that all struggles, including an unequal war like the one that Muslims were leading, because a big part of what confronted the challenges that confronted Muslims in Medina is sort of the defeatists who are saying, look at all the sacrifices we are making, look at all the hardship we are and Mecca is large enough, powerful enough, prominent enough, and its allies to hardly feel the scratch we are inflicting upon them. But the main difference is that you, in your struggle, have a relationship with Allah. If genuine and if real, it's a relationship that is not available to your enemy. That's a source of inspiration and strength for Muslims throughout different periods of their history. And when they forget something as straightforward and as simple as this, is that when they've performed miserably, as they do these days. Yeah, anyway. Okay. So إنا أنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق لتحكم بين الناس بما أراك الله ولا تكن للخائنين خصيما. So this is now, we have bestowed upon you, this is Muhammad, we've bestowed upon you from on high this divine writ, setting forth the truth so that you may judge between people in accordance with what God has taught you. Bima arak Allah was what Allah has revealed to you, what Allah has taught you, what Allah has instructed you. Okay. Hence, do not contend with those who are false to their trust, but pray to God to forgive them. Behold, God is indeed much forgiving, a dispenser of grace. Okay. ولا تكن للخائنين خصيما واستغفر الله إن الله كان غفورا رحيما ولا تجادل الذين يختانون أنفسهم إن الله لا يحب من كان خوانا أثيما. Let me first deal with 105 and then I'll take the series right after it. Okay. In the midst of the challenges and difficulties that are confronting Muslims, and we find this sort of constantly a back and forth in Surah An-Nisa, the blowback in Medina itself among those who claim to have converted, or nominal converts, or even in some cases, as we will see a bit later, people who had even converted and I mean, they for all the indications is that they were legitimate converts, but they struggled with their own weaknesses and their own willingness to sacrifice. And what some of the challenges that we've already talked about are like the group of people who said, okay, we remain Muslim, but we've gone back to Mecca. It's a challenge because they're effectively telling the Prophet, ﷺ, your insistence on the whole thing, the constitution of Medina, Bay'ah, the Ansar, and so on, it is as if, although they don't come out and explicitly say it, but it's as if they're saying, all of this is an exercise of discretionary judgment that is not binding upon us. And hence, we don't see anything wrong with being Muslim and going back and living in Mecca. That's one challenge. But the other challenges were like those who withdrew from Uhud, who were saying, why can't we back down from military confrontations? Why are you taking a defiant position? Let's just sit and wait and see if they come to us as invaders, rather than, which is a classically reasonable thing to be said by cowards. The reasonability of cowards is that, okay, well, why don't we just pay attention, mind ourselves, mind our own business, and, wait. Maybe they won't come and invade us. But not only that, the reforms, because you don't have just the external threats, but you have these reforms that are meeting with considerable resistance within Medinian society itself. Reforms particularly that have to do with financial rights of women, including inheritance, and has to do with orphans, which is a class of society that has traditionally been dispossessed of rights. Despite the fact that in Arab societies there were a considerable number of orphans because of feuds and even travel and the number of people that would be lost in travel and things like that. And the number of people that would die from ta'un, from plagues and diseases and all types of reasons. Also, resistance in terms of giving mawali. Mawali are people that don't come from prominent tribes themselves, but they're under the protection of a prominent tribe. So they're not native to society, but in order to exist in society, they become the client of a prominent tribe. And as we already encountered, that among the prominent tribes of Arabia, they didn't want to marry their daughters to mawali, or to orphans for that matter. And the Prophet ﷺ comes and changes these laws. And a lot of the pushback to this is complaining about, isn't it enough that we are having to sacrifice money? Isn't it enough that we are being asked to give money to the poor, give money to the war effort, on top of all of that, we have to give all these groups of people their rights. And as we will see, the way that Surah An-Nisa then moves on from this, is that coming and challenging the judgments of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, the record here is fascinating because, yeah, you have some people like Ibn Ubay, who, so-called the head of the hypocrites, who come in and defies the Prophet ﷺ in an unintelligent ways, in brash and rude and vulgar ways. But there are people that didn't do, their challenges weren't like Abdullah ibn Ubay, but their challenges were to question the wisdom and to say, well, how does that make any sense? It's not that we're saying that this change shouldn't happen. We're saying it shouldn't happen now. Too much is being asked. And so the underscoring at this juncture, and we'll see what Surah An-Nisa deals with right after this, is that, as Muhammad Asad puts it, the divine writ, a kitab, that these are judgments that have to do with al-haq, with truth. It is not a discretionary matter. It is not a matter of, this is about truth and principle. There is a statement commenting Umar ibn al-Khattab, or at least in some versions of the riwayah, is that he's asked about this ayah after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And reportedly his response is, لا يقولن أحدكم قضيت بما أراني الله فإن الله لم يجعل ذلك إلا لنبيه ولكن ليجهد رأيه لأن الرأي ظن وليس علم. That Umar comes in and says, after the death of the Prophet, none of you should say, I have ruled according to what God has shown me and what God has told me, because that is only for his Prophet. All you can say is, I am ruling according to my juhd, my ijtihad, my judgment, and this is as a matter of dhan, as probability, and not certitude. Knowing how long it took for human thought to differentiate between the judgment of the sacred and the judgment of the profane, and the fact that this just occurs so seamlessly in the Islamic tradition so early on is noteworthy. Nevertheless, this has to do with epistemology and interpretation and so on, but the foundational principle, which is not reflected in Umar's the statement attributed to Umar radiallahu anhu, is that there are issues of principle, of haqq, involved here. But then what follows from that a number of people, especially those close to the Prophet ﷺ, were frustrated, while there is a group that is frustrated by the reform projects. There's a group that is frustrated by the fact that the Prophet ﷺ is not taking hostile actions against the critics and not silencing the critics, is not exiling them, is not executing them, is not arresting them. And we don't pause often at this, but it is noteworthy that Allah comes and tells the Prophet, وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا. So, kha'inin they are. Kha'inin meaning the betrayal, traitors. What does Muhammad Asad translated us? This is what who are false to their trust. Yeah, okay, same thing. Are they traitors? They are. But this is not about you dedicating yourself to being their sworn enemy. Do not, Muhammad Asad just says, do not contend with them. Al-Khasim is, an enemy is called a khasm. Someone who is your opposite, or the opposite of who you are. That's where the word is derived from. Khasim, it's as if saying, it's the point of upholding the truth is not for you to turn your struggle for truth into personal animosities with individuals. It's like in our modern parlance to say, rise above it. And by saying that, it's also responded to the hardliners who are saying, Now, wastaghfirullah, this is 106, right? There is a debate here that has to do with language and grammar. And then I'm going to tell you some narratives. Muhammad Asad chooses the point of view that says, pray Allah to forgive them. So it's as if he reads it, وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمُ اللَّهِ. Others said, no, it shouldn't, that's not the meaning. Astaghfirullah means, in all cases, you should always seek Allah's forgiveness. In other words, it's not that you're asking forgiveness for them, but you are in a state, because you are dealing with animosities and with hostilities, your state of being and your consciousness should be one of consistent istighfar. Whenever we feel hostility or enmity or competition or antagonism, you can never guarantee what sins, in fact, you fall in despite of yourself. And if you are wise, you would be in a constant state of istighfar. I don't agree with Muhammad Asad that it is saying, pray Allah to forgive them. I don't think, although we know that when Abdullah ibn Ubay died, the Prophet ﷺ prayed in his funeral, which is quite amazing. I mean, when you think about it, that a sworn enemy that gave him a headache throughout his life. But I don't agree that the Quranic text tells the Prophet ﷺ to pray for them. It tells him, rise above it. Don't make them the issue. Okay. There is a narrative, and this is an example of how the narratives of tradition can arise from a real historical example, but then sort of branch out to ways that historical examples can be spinned for very different reasons that are not historically defensible. And here, 105 typically, the story that is said in the context of verse 105 is the story of Ibn al-Ubayraq. So I'll start first with the version of this narrative that is false, that is not authentic. Reportedly, a man called Ibn al-Ubayraq stole, and remember, this is the fabricated one, the false one, stole the property of a Jew living in Medina. And when the Jew accuses Ibn al-Ubayraq of stealing his property, the Prophet ﷺ defends him. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes and says to the Prophet, don't defend. It was wrong of you to defend Ibn al-Ubayraq because Ibn al-Ubayraq is a is a thief. It's someone who committed treachery. And thus it says, وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا, that it is saying, so. Now come to the different versions of this incident, and you see how different it is. Ibn al-Ubayraq, again, Ibn al-Ubayraq steals property. However, he doesn't steal the property of a Jew. He steals property and defends himself by accusing a Jew of having committed the theft. When Muslims start investigating the matter, it becomes clear that the Jew is innocent of the charges and that Ibn al-Ubayraq is guilty. It is reported in various sources that Ibn al-Ubayraq at this point, when it becomes clear that that all the fingers are pointing towards him, he makes a run for it. He escapes. First he escapes to Mecca, then he escapes to Sham, to Syria, and it is even said that that the reason he left Mecca is that because he committed another theft in Mecca, this time of course against Muslims. And Ibn Ubayraq, the reports say that he even eventually settles in a Hurrat Bani Salim, a tribe called Bani Salim, and that he irtadda an al-Islam, that he leaves Islam and goes back to being a polytheist. And in fact, that he prays that he continued to be a polytheist until he dies. The historical narrative of Ibn al-Ubayraq as a murtad it's reported widely, so it is all indicators are that in fact that isn't in fact what happened, and that he stole something and attempted to accuse an innocent person of having committed the theft, and that he makes a run for it and eventually leaves Islam when he is about to be exposed, is again all the indicators is that is in fact what happens. How does that report become into something that is spinned into a narrative that, if anything, it makes the Prophet look really bad? Someone commits a theft and then the Prophet defends him, and then Allah comes and says, don't defend treacherous people, which of course made it into Islamophobic literature. They've completely ignored the other part of Ibn al-Ubayraq as a murtad and all of that stuff, but homed in on this is a larger topic, but there is a portion of hadith, without a doubt, that was circulated by people, narrators, who I think all evidence is that they were only nominally Muslim. And that part of justifying, and here again the work of Farhan al-Maliki is very valuable, part of justifying the immorality of dictators and the immorality of people in power was to basically say, well, if the prophet himself did things that were wrong, then certainly our rulers cannot be blamed. It is not an accident that you find that the people who are always involved in narrating versions like the Prophet ﷺ defending Ibn al-Ubayrak, the narrators are always very close associates to corrupt power. And, of course, if Islamophobes will always be able to come and, like hyenas, pick on these narratives. And as long as we don't have an honest discourse about our own tradition that confronts, that some of the men of Bukhari and some of the men of Muslim had very suspicious associations with power, we leave this tradition vulnerable to the efforts of people like the Islamophobes. Okay. Now, notice 107. This is actually, it will go on to 114. Okay. The story of Ibn Ubayrak, by the way, I've just notice here, this is look at 112. ومن يكسب خطيئة أو إثما ثم يرمي به بريئا فقد احتمل بهتانا وإثما مبينا. Well, whoever commits fault or sin and then blames an innocent person, throws the blame on an innocent person, then they withstand a great guilt and a flagrant sin. And those who said that this is about Ibn Ubayrak, this is the way that they explain that Ibn Ubayrak committed the theft and then accused an innocent person, and then when he was about to expose, and then so they say, see, this is talking about the Ibn Ubayrak incident. Let's go on and then I'll come back to this point. Okay, so I think, yes, the story of Ibn Ubayrak does fit, or some of the ayat seem to be addressing a situation like what transpired with Ibn Ubayrak. Committing a crime, trying to blame someone else, then becoming ultimately someone who makes run for all of that. But I don't think that these ayat were only revealed to address the historical incident of Ibn Ubayrak. There were a number of situations that, and which I'll explain, the number of situations that these ayat were addressing. Okay, so ولا تجادل عن الذين يختانون أنفسهم إن الله لا يحب من كان خوانا أثيما يستخفون من الناس ولا يستخفون من الله وهو معهم إذ يبيتون ما لا يرضى من القول وكان الله بما يعملون محيطا ها أنتم هؤلاء جادلتم عنهم في الحياة الدنيا فمن يجادل الله عنهم يوم القيامة أما يكون عليهم وكيلا ومن يعمل سوءا أو يظلم نفسه ثم يستغفر الله يجد الله غفورا رحيما ومن يكسب إثما فإنما يكسبه على نفسه وكان الله عليما حكيما ومن يكسب خطيئة أو إثما ثم يرمي به بريئا فقد احتمل بهتانا وإثما مبينا. So takes us all the way to 112. Then 113 ولولا فضل الله عليك ورحمته لهمت طائفة منهم أي يضلوك وما يضلون إلا أنفسهم وما يضرونك من شيء وأنزل الله عليك الكتاب والحكمة وعلمك ما لم تكن تعلم وكان فضل الله عليك عظيما. لا خير في كثير من نجواهم إلا من أمر بصدقة أو معروف أو إصلاح بين الناس ومن يفعل ذلك ابتغاء مرضات الله فسوف نؤتيه أجرا عظيما. This is all the way to 114. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's take the translation, because it's a long stretch, and then put it in context. Okay. Where were we? So 107. Okay. Okay, yet do not argue in behalf of those who are false to their own selves. Verily, God does not love those who betray their trust and persist in sinful ways. They would conceal their doings from men, but from God they cannot conceal them. For God is with them wherever they devise. In the dark of night, all manners of belief which God does not approve. That whenever they're devising things that God does not approve of, God is with them. And God indeed encompasses with God's knowledge whatever they do. Or you might well argue in their behalf in the life of this world, but who will argue on their behalf with God on the day of resurrection? Or who will be their defender? Yet he who does evil or otherwise sins against himself and thereafter prays God to forgive him shall find God much forgiving, a dispenser of grace. And he who commits a sin commits it only to his own hurt or against himself. And God is indeed all-knowing and wise. But he who commits a fault or sin and then throws the blame on an innocent person burdens himself with the guilt, and yet another flagrant sin. But for God's favor upon thee and God's grace, some of those who are false to themselves would indeed endeavor to lead you astray, yet none but themselves do they lead astray. Nor can they harm you in any way, since God has bestowed upon you from on high the divine writ, and given you wisdom, and has imparted upon you the knowledge of what you did not know, and God's favor upon you is tremendous indeed. Okay. Well, let's take 114 as well, because it's still within the same thing. No good comes as a rule out of their secret confabulations, save such that as are devoted to enjoining charity or equitable dealings or setting things to rights between people. And unto him who does this out of longing for God's goodly acceptance, we shall in time grant a mighty reward. Okay, so you notice that this whole series of ayat that preceded, that come after, Allah underscores that the judgment of the Prophet ﷺ is a judgment pursuant to revelation. The whole story of Ibn Ubayrak and those who said, well, these ayat have to do with the incident of Ibn Ubayraq is evidence of social tensions that are taking place that these ayat address. What are these social tensions? We already saw a part of it by saying that there are these critics and those who advocate a hard line with these critics, and as we said in 105 and 106, that Allah tells the Prophet ﷺ, the point is not to turn them into sworn enemies and become distracted in a struggle of hostility and animosity with this group. However, we normally in modern Muslim parlance in particular, we just say the hypocrites. But who are these people that we call the hypocrites? Many of them, in fact, were not followers of Abdullah ibn Ubay. They were not a group of the Abdullah ibn Ubay fan club. Many of them, the problem with them, it's like the incident of what will come later, Masjid al-Dirar, is that they have become a group of whiners and complainers. They when they are with the Prophet ﷺ, they don't express dissent. But behind the Prophet's back, when they meet in their homes, and we know quite a few of these people, in other words, we have the names of quite a few, and it is very interesting because there were critics. There is a remarkable correlation between tribal affiliations and some of these critics. So, in other words, the people who were the critics among the Khazraj were very different than the group of critics among the Aus. And when I say very different, meaning that the Ausi critics would meet with one another, and the Ausi Khazrajis would meet with one another. The group of people that actually were from Mecca and did the Hijrah, but started having second thoughts, they had their own clique. So in other words, they were cliques. And these cliques would meet in their own social events. يستخفون من الناس ولا يستخفون من الله. And they did whatever they can to keep, it was not necessarily a conspiracy, but to hide from the group of people that they knew were solid supporters of the Prophet ﷺ. And they were consistently voicing objections to the reforms undertaken by the Prophet ﷺ, and at the same time refusing. So we know, as Surah An-Nisa itself will talk about in a second, refusing to implement what they were being asked to do when it came to giving shares to especially orphans, to young people that, or to people who did, in the Arab psyche, if you if you could not take part in combat, then you were not entitled to a share of inheritance. And they insisted on not complying with the commands of the Quran and the orders of the Prophet. They also insisted on not allowing orphans under their control freedom to marry outside the family, because once they marry outside the family, they no longer control their wealth. Moreover, there were other things, like they were scandalized by the Prophet's precedent in receiving complaints by women, and they were scandalized by the idea of the Quran comes and addresses these complaints by women. Because I forgot the name of the guy. I should have written it down, but I didn't. That جرأ علينا النساء, that this has emboldened women over us. If we have problems with, whether the problem is an improper marriage, as we will see, where an uncle married his niece to someone, and then the Prophet comes and invalidates the marriage because it wasn't, this is in Surah An-Nisa, it will come, because she didn't approve of the marriage, or whether it is a occasion of zihar, or whether it is women complaining about why don't they get a share of inheritance, and so on. This group was consistently, although having taken the Shahada and more or less appearing for prayer in the masjid, although, we have interesting stories about this as well. Eventually, they come up with the idea, well, why don't we build our own masjid where we can skip on prayers without anyone seeing us? So they actually, we have reports of them saying, why didn't you, we didn't see you in prayer. Oh, well, we were praying in our own private musalla, which is, a very convenient, a nice excuse. Anyway, so while the Prophet ﷺ is told to rise above it, but at the same time, Allah is telling them, none of what you do escapes Allah's attention. Allah sees you, knows your intentions, knows the type of gossip and what is the word I'm looking for? When you undermine, you undermine what the state is trying to do. There is a word for it. Sabotage. Like, the type of sabotage, that your insistence on saying, okay, fine, let them do it, I'm not going to do it. Okay. يبيتون ما لا يرضى من الله لا يبيتون إذ يبيتون ما لا يرضى من القول. That what they talk about, they know that what they talk about, and if the proof that they know that what they talk about is what Allah does not approve of, is that they do it in secret. The fact that they do it in secret is because they know that their gossip is haram. This is not the way that they should be talking about the Prophet ﷺ or the companions of the Prophet or the true believers, eh, some of it would be shockingly upsetting for we Sunni Muslims in particular have had the tendency of sort of sanitizing the tradition, but some of it was really offensive. I mean, the way that they would talk about the Prophet. Now, add to this problem is that in the same way there were hardline people that wanted a more hardline action against these folks, like obviously Umar ibn Khattab, who was a hardliner in most things. When it came to ostracizing these people, and it came to as we will see, the Prophet ﷺ would receive complaints from women that, okay, the Quran said that I have a share in inheritance. Well, such and such refuses to give me my share. So the Prophet ﷺ would tell them, as long as you are living in Medina, you don't have a choice, you must give them their share. And they would continue to be obstinate. I mean, they wouldn't say no. What they would often say is effective, like our modern Muslims say, inshallah. They say, sure, okay, yeah, well, I just have to, there's their money is involved with this trade right now, and I just have to figure out what share, what part is theirs. And they would make excuses. And so came the point that they would become criticized as, you're not doing what the Prophet ﷺ is telling you. You're hypocrites. You're acting like hypocrites. But some of these people, many of these people actually, had tribal alliances. They were members of clans in Medina. And so people with strong records as Muslims and as believers would start defending them, that, oh no, but they're well-intentioned. It's not, they're not bad, they're just well-intentioned, and it is complicated, and it is true, the money of such and such and such is caught up in this, trade, and it's caught up. Well, in other words, and this is ها أنتم هؤلاء جادلتم عنهم في الحياة الدنيا. This is 109, where it says, there are some of you who are defending them, making excuses for them. You're saying it's like some of you want the hard line, and some of you are lowering all the standards and saying, well, but they're good Muslims. They're although they are failing in the ethical tests, the proof is in whether they are giving people their rights, and they are not giving people their rights, and yet you are defending them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sort of lays this bare, exposing us to ourselves, and says, think about it. Because if you are defending them in this life, are you willing to wage the same defense in the hereafter? Who is going to defend them in the hereafter? If you are willing to stake your neck, put your neck out, that is sort of the test of true conscience. who are you willing to be stuck with in the hereafter? I mean, put it differently, the Prophet ﷺ taught us that in the hereafter you are with who you love. Okay, so if you are defending the moral status of a people or a person or a group of people, are you willing to have their position in the hereafter? A lot of times people give an answer to this that has far more to do with their ego than the truth of their feelings. But if they truly believe in the hereafter, it's a fair question. Who do you want? What status do you want to end up being stuck with? Okay. So now here's the truly remarkable part. Some said that, as I said, 112 about doing something and then accusing an innocent person, that this is about the story of Abu Ubayraq. But much when you look at the many of the incidents unfolding at the time of Surah An-Nisa, you find something else that is truly remarkable. Remarkable to me, please, is that many of these people, their excuses for not complying with the reforms or the system of rights that Surah An-Nisa puts into effect, they often blamed not just circumstance, but blamed their failures on others. And let me put this, in more concrete examples. So they would say, for instance, and there's a story that we'll come to in a second. There was one of them, for instance, who had an orphan who apparently she was not attractive, but not only she was not attractive, but she was also blind. And he refused to give her inheritance. No one wanted to marry her. But he would use the excuse that she's living with me as an excuse for not giving her inheritance. And the fact that because she's blind and not marriageable, as an excuse for, well, no one is going to inherit her, so why give her money? Why don't I keep her money and I'm taking care of her? And when ultimately the Prophet ﷺ confronts him about it, he yells back, how could it be that we come to a point where blind, unmarriageable women are entitled to an inheritance? The blame for not giving her her inheritance, he's laying it on her because she's not attractive or not marriageable and blind. We have many other stories like this. So stories where people would refuse to give a woman her dowry. She gets married, she would receive a dowry, the father would keep the dowry or the uncle would keep the dowry and refuse to hand it over to her. And then they would say, well, it is because her husband is a man of ill repute, and I'm worried if I give her the money that her husband will take the money from her. We have a story like that. We have another story where it is not the husband who is accused of being a man of ill repute, but the woman herself this is an uncle, and he accuses the niece. He says that the niece is a woman of vanities. She spends her money on vanities. And if I give her the money, she will waste it on vain things. In one version of this narrative, that she likes music. I'm not sure, what did that, is she going to spend it on, singer? I don't know. There is several. There is one where a man is told, again confronted about not giving several members of his family their share of their inheritance. And he says that the reason I didn't give them the share of inheritance is because my wakil, his agent for his trade, who had traveled with his merchandise to Sham, is holding my money and not giving me an accounting. And he was lying. I mean, the agent, who was not Muslim, by the way, and did not live in Medina. So, and here we get then 112, that who as من يكسب خطيئة ثم يرمي به بريئة, in a different light, right? If you are blaming others for your moral failures, look at it. Some are defending the weakness of their friends and making excuses for them. Some are being morally wishy-washy or morally cowardly in saying, well, it's not their fault, it's the fault of this, it's the fault of that. This is what Surah An-Nisa is. That's why it is a surah that lays you bare, that sort of rips the bandit off. Then we come to 113. That the pressure they are placing, the politics of defiance and obstruction is strong enough, and the group of apologists, those who are saying, they're recent converts to Islam, we need them for the war effort. If you demand that they give orphans their rights, give children their rights, give widows their rights, and the problem of widows was, by the way, a very big problem, that they give, share of inheritance, we're going to lose them. You have to understand when 113 is وَلَوْلَا فَضْلُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكَ وَرَحْمَتُهُ لَهَمَّتْ طَائِفَةٌ مِّنْهُمْ أَن يُضِلُّوكَ مَا يُضِلُّونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسَهُم. That you came close to actually being led astray. Here, they're led astray, meaning what? Meaning
saying, yes, I understand. It's okay. I understand. There are a number of reports in this context. They're all very closely related. A lot of times it's the names that we have variances and on who is precisely was involved. But that the Prophet ﷺ reportedly, well, the Prophet always says to a number of people as they come to him and say, hold off until I consider the matter. حتى أنظر في الأمر, right? Hold off until I consider the matter. And we have these reports that, although, I mean, I have my certain reservations, but okay, not to complicate things, that the Prophet ﷺ is tempted in order to appease some of the Ansar who are very strenuously defending their relatives as to why they have not implemented what is being demanded of them, is tempted to say, oh, it's okay, fine, let's wait on them, to put it off. And that this is what 113 comes is that Allah, not that he does that, but that he is tempted to do it. And that then Allah is saying that if it hasn't been for Allah strengthening you, you would have indeed been tempted to accommodate them. But this is about al-haq. This is about the truth. And yes, it is very difficult. You're leading an external war. You're leading an internal war. People are being commanded to do what they are not accustomed to do and not always willing to do. But this is about a cause. And therefore, in this pursuit, which again doesn't surprise us, political expedience and accommodations for pragmatic politics has its serious limits. Okay. وأنزل الله عليك الكتاب والحكمة وعلمك ما لم تكن تعلم وكان فضل الله عليك عظيما. That and here again it is that holding steadfast to a program of moral uprightness, to an ethical program, is the essence of receiving the divine writ, al-kitab, wal-hikmah, and wisdom. That to persevere by principle and implement the principle, it is the essence of what revelation and wisdom is about. Okay. Then we come to 114. لا خير في كثير من نجواهم إلا من أمر بصدقة أو معروف أو إصلاح بين الناس ومن يفعل ذلك ابتغاء مرضات الله فسوف نؤتيه أجرا عظيما. Okay. So a question that posed itself in different forms to the Prophet ﷺ is, and this is one of the funniest excuses that you get from some of the reports, is, well, not funny, but it's actually real life, is, wait, so what do we talk about? if we can't talk about, it's as if, I mean, they don't say put it this way, but when I read one of these people, same people who are accused of resisting, going and complaining to when Abu Bakr confronts one of them, and he says, what, you don't want us to gather in our nadi, in our forums, and what do we talk about? It's as if saying, if we can't whine and complain and talk about all the things that are wrong, what the heck do you want us to talk about? And لا خير في كثير, it's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes and says, okay, all this talk, you want to know what moral talk is about. Flip it on its head. What moral talk is about. Man amara bi sadaqa, acting in charity. أو معروف, or doing good. أو إصلاح بين الناس, or instead of driving people apart, creating enmity and animosity between people, talking about what does exactly the opposite. I mean, can you actually, if you pause at this and you think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, check yourself, because this is, again, historical circumstance demonstrating a timeless moral principle. What is the timeless moral principle? Check yourself. Are you talking about a sadaqah, doing something charitable? Are you talking about a ma'ruf, something that is good, immoral good that you are espousing? Are you talking about islah bayn al-nas, something that would remove hostility and enmity and bring people together? Because if you are not, then you should be worried. Am I talking about then, do I fall into that caveat of لا خير في كثير من نجواهم? That in fact, what I'm talking about falls into something immoral. This is the Quranic training. Can you imagine if we are raised from the time we are children, that taught to check yourself, because Allah is warning us, are you serving an affirmative good in your conversation? It is not, that doesn't mean that for sure you are, then your conversation is immoral. But the danger is that it is immoral. That's why it says, لا خير في كثير من نجواهم, in a lot of what they talk about. Not لا خير في نجواهم, in all what they talk about, but in a lot of what they talk about. Again, historical incidentals in service of timeless moral principles. Okay. And then 115, ومن يشاقق الرسول من بعد ما تبين له الهدى ويتبع غير سبيل المؤمنين نوله ما تولى ونصله جهنم وساءت مصيره. Muhammad, as it translates, cuts himself from the apostle and follows a path other than that of the believers, him shall we leave unto that which he himself has chosen. Okay. And shall cause him to endure hell, and how evil a journey's end. Okay. Um, a couple of points here. Notice a lot of, especially more contemporary Muslims, think that 115 is talking about unbelievers. It's not. It's talking about, as the entire context of the discourse, it is talking about those who have received the guidance. مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ الْهُدَى. In fact, they have become Muslim. But their Islam is but a label and an excuse to, in reality, not achieve what is Islam in any real sense. And historically, again, it is these people who had converted to Islam, but they are deviating, yushaqiq al-Rasul, meaning not just split apart from Rasul, but they have become the opposite of what the Prophet wants. And they have followed a path other than what the believers that they know are the real believers want. So those who Islam for them, it's like it becomes a rubber stamp excuse for living an amoral life that has nothing to do with the type of moral existence demanded by Islam, and the label of Islam itself becomes their excuse. Well, I'm a good Muslim, so, don't bother me with anything else. I'm fine the way I am. Now, the fact that their consequence is that Allah promises these individuals, the illegitimate Muslims, the Muslims who fancy themselves Muslims by identity and by name, but not by moral course and commitment and sacrifice. They're promised hellfire, okay, but notice, نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى. This expression, I've always paused at this expression, نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى. Muhammad Asad translates it as, what again? What number was this? That we leave unto that which he himself has chosen. نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى. تولية الشيء is what you ally yourself to, right? What you commit yourself to, what you become attached and wedded to. That's تولية الشيء. So Allah tells you, for these people, we indeed let them be attached to, wedded to, committed to what they have chosen to be allied to and wedded to and committed to. And what is it that they have allied themselves to? Remember that if you fill your space with dhikr, if Allah is in your space, if you understand that being with Allah means a series of moral commitments that will often require great struggle and great sacrifice, and a conscientiousness against the apologetics of the self and the excuses made for the self. What ultimately they've wedded themselves to and what they've allied themselves to is their egos. And it's Allah is like saying, you have associated partners with Allah. What is it that you've associated partners with? Your true God is not God. Yeah, you're officially Muslim, but your true God is yourself. That is ultimately your dispositive, absolute, real frame of reference. It is not al-kitab wal-hikmah, and notice, al-kitab wal-hikmah. It is not the divine writ, as Muhammad Asad puts it, and wisdom. Wisdom is everything that is encompassed by rational knowledge, including logic, including reasonableness, and so on. It is not revelation and reason, in other words, but it is nothing more than your own impulses. Your revelation is inferior to and in service to your impulses, and so is your reason. Your ego tells you what you want, and then you use your reason to defend what you want. And this is exactly the whole state of the whiners and complainers and the backbiters and at the time of the Prophet, is that they're using all types of arguments about why what the Prophet is doing can't work. But it is, God is subservient to their whim, and so is the reason. And so this expression, نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى, it's so profoundly simple and straightforward, but terrifying. It's like saying, instead of saying that Allah abandons you to yourself, that it's like, okay, fine, there you go. Good luck. You know, your fate in the hereafter, but in your course of getting to the hereafter, it doesn't sound that pleasant either, because you just go from folds of darkness and confusion and doubt and from one state to another. And it's all the bed that you made for yourself. What time is it? Okay, let's take a 3-minute break.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In There is a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ about 114 لا خير في كثير من نجواهم, um, which warrants reflection that the Prophet ﷺ says ألا أخبركم بأفضل من درجة الصيام والصدقة والصلاة, that shall I tell you of something that is of a higher degree than siyam and sadaqah and salah? And he says إصلاح ذات البين وإفساد ذات البين الحالقة. الحالقة. Okay, so that إصلاح ذات البين is to strive to bring harmony and to alleviate the causes of discord among people. وإفساد ذات البين الحالقة, that one of the worst moral failures, a fatal moral failure, is to spread enmity and hostility between people. For a variety of reasons, I think this hadith is talking, partly in the context, because of the context of the hadith itself, it's talking about the najwa, and not necessarily the act of sadaqah or the act of salah or the act of siyam, but that it's one thing to tell people to pray, to tell people to fast, to tell people to pay sadaqah, which is good. But to actively also then, through your discourse, instead of, which is what by our innate nature we find entertaining, is to speak about things that drive people apart, instead of bringing them together. Okay. Let's move on. So, of course, 116 إن الله لا يغفر أن يشرك به ويغفر ما دون ذلك لمن يشاء ومن يشرك بالله فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا إن يدعون من دونه إلا إناثا وإن يدعون إلا شيطانا مريدا لعنه الله وقال لتأخذن من عبادك نصيبا مفروضا ولأضلنهم ولأمنينهم ولأمرنهم فليبتكن آذان الأنعام ولأمرنهم فليغيرن خلق الله ومن يتخذ الشيطان وليا من دون الله فقد خسر خسرانا مبينا. When I have a hard time pronouncing things, this is the time where my hearing affects me the most. يعدوهم ويمنينهم وما يعدوهم الشيطان إلا غرورا أولئك مأواهم جهنم ولا يجدون عنها محيصا. Okay, so continuing on, the ayah 116 is probably, again, a very famous ayah that you hear quoted a lot of times out of context. But shirk in all its forms, when Allah tells us that
sins that that one commits, possibly out of weakness, out of omission, that they're qualitatively different than accepting for yourself to effectively have a deity other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that, Allah is warning us, is an unforgivable sin. It is of a different quality. Now, Allah is ultimately just, and Allah knows your best efforts, and Allah knows your intentions. So, this is not a game of, yeah, but, how about a situation that I do my best in this and do my best in that? And it is not talking, Allah knows if you are truly doing your best. If you, in your heart, you truly want to have only Allah as the single deity that you are beholding to. Allah knows if this is truly what is in your heart. And Allah is just. But if you are oblivious to this and you accept a deity for yourself other than God, that is the absolute moral failure. And it addresses, of course, the shirk in terms of polytheists, that وَمَا إِنْ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِهِ إِلَّا إِنَاثًا, those who are worshipping deities other than God, meaning the idols, which are often were feminine idols. But worshipping anything other than God is in effect worshipping shaitan. Shaitan is sworn to have human beings worship anything other than God. Whether that anything is an idol with a whole host of mythology attached to it, or whether that effective deity is the dollar or money or gold, or whether it's the ego. It's like Allah is the light, and as you veer away from the light, you are drifting towards darkness. All that darkness surrounding the light is shaitani. And the reminder that shaitan has sworn لَأَتَّخِذَنَّ مِنْ عِبَادِكَ نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا, that Allah, the shaitan has sworn to how does Muhammad Asad translate it? I'm stumbling over my words. 118. Shaitan has said, verily of thy servants I shall most certainly take my due share. Okay, simple enough. And shall lead them astray and fill them with vain desires. And I shall command them, and they will cut off the ears of cattle, and I shall command them, and they will corrupt God's creation. Okay. So that's Muhammad Asad's translation. So that Allah will take a due share. Nasiban mafruda. It's as if Shaitan is saying, I know that there is going to be always all of them submitting to you is an impossibility. Okay. and lead them astray. وَلَأُمَنِّيَنَّهُمْ وَلَأَمُرَّنَّهُمْ. So وَلَأُمَنِّيَنَّهُمْ, I will give them vain hopes and desires. That's okay. So وَلِيُبَتِّكَنَّ آذَانَ الْأَنْعَامِ. First, let's posit this, that polytheists, among their practice was that they would commit a certain share of whatever cattle they trade to specific idols. And they mark the cattle that have been committed to the idols by cutting off or by marking the ears. Often they would clip a part of the ear or they would split the ear. So that's the context. وَلَأَمُرْنَهُمْ فَلِيُغَيِّرَنَّ خَلْقِ اللَّهِ. Here, the best thing, the way that theologians would often put it is, Allah created everything لِفَضِيلَة, for a purpose and for a goodly purpose. Anything that Allah has created لِفَضِيلَة فَأُسْتُعِينَ بِهِ فِي رَزِيلَة, that then is used for irazila, something sinful and immoral. فهو تغيير لخلق الله. This is what I think this is what Abu Hayyan says in his tafsir. We understand the clipping or the cutting of the ears of cattle, which is a classic polytheistic practice, and a common, by the way, practice in among idol worshippers in pre-Islamic times, very widespread practice. But the very idea of تغيير خلق الله, it is, some people have understood it as any change in what Allah has created, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense, because we process natural elements for medicinal purposes all the time. We process natural elements in industry all the time. So تغيير خلق الله, it doesn't get at the moral heart of the issue. And that's why I believe it's Abu Hayyan who said it, that if you take something and you use it, you alter its purpose from a fadila to irazila, from a good moral purpose to an immoral purpose, then you have altered Allah's creation. And this then becomes all-encompassing, because even a knife, I can use a knife for something good, and I can use a knife for something immoral. There are a couple of other things that probably we should mention here too. That the cutting of the ears of cattle were called baha'ir wa sawa'ib, and they used to have different titles for them. But also, a lot of Muslim scholars commentated on the practice of al-khisi, or castration, and they often cite these ayat in condemning the very wide practice of khusyan. And for me, it's noteworthy because in pre-modern legal systems, the first condemnation of castration, an illegal system, that I found was in the Islamic legal system. Castration was so widespread, so widely practiced, that no legal system before, and even the Islamic legal system, by the way, was not able to put an end to the practice. Although Islamic law, you'll find jurists, without exception, as far as I know, say al-ikhsa haram, that castration is haram and all of that. It was so widespread and it was so common for people to castrate slaves. And the reason that they castrated slaves was that, there was one purpose that was really, and that is they wanted singers that would have very change the nature of their voice. And so if they castrate the slaves early enough, they could affect their vocal cords. But the other purpose, and the more common purpose, was that to have slaves served in their households and not have to worry about them intermingling with the women of the house, and women of the house not having to wear their veil before the slaves, and not having to cover themselves before their slaves, and so on. So castrated slaves were more expensive than non-castrated slaves. But even Islamic law wasn't able to put an end to the practice, although, of course, it's noteworthy that the first legal system to prohibit castration was Islamic law. The other, again, a practice that Islamic law was not able to put an end to, although it's very widely condemned, is the washm. And wasl al-shar is more complicated, but washm in particular, and that is where the among a lot of societies throughout Africa, throughout Arabia, throughout Europe for most of its history, was effectively like what we do with tattoos today. To mark the body, to communicate a variety of things, to communicate marital status, to communicate ownership, to communicate social status, class status, tribal affiliation. And I think, and this is my own interpretation, where I think that the reason that there was such a vehement condemnation of the practices of washm is because it stratified and it marked human beings in ways that were inconsistent with the idea that human beings are sawasiya ka'asnan al-misht. People would be, you would, I mean, it was really, and when you look at the anthropology of practices of body markings, it really contributed to systems of tribalism and clannish politics, and there were markings for a freed person, markings for a slave, and then you would always look at the markings to decide how you should behave towards a person. This is an example. I think, where the incidentals can teach us a lot about morality, because we can ask the questions of what ways do we mark human beings today so that it affects the way we deal with them socially. So, for instance, and this is again, Allahu Alam, but this is my own. I think when even passports and ID cards becomes a way of differentiating moral treatment of human beings, they become problematic. Although you're not marking the skin, but you're marking the human being. Okay. About 116, that Allah does not forgive shirk. There is a narrative that the narrative in all the versions, the shaykh is not mentioned or is not named, but it simply says that a shaykh جاء شيخ إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. I'm going to first say it in Arabic and then said يا نبي الله إني شيخ متهتك في الذنوب إلا أني لم أشرك بالله شيئا منذ عرفته وأمنت به ولم أتخذ من دونه وليا ولم أواقع المعاصي جرأة على الله وما توهمت طرفة عين أني أعجز الله هربا وإني لنادم تائب مستغفر. This is what I remember. I don't remember how there are a couple more sentences that I don't remember. That a man comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, an older man, and he says that إني متهتك في الذنوب, that I am a man who's been plagued by sin. I've committed a lot of sins. However, I've never, since believing, I've never associated partners with Allah, and I've never committed a sin in jur'ah, in open defiance to God, but out of weakness. And I never believed that somehow I will escape, or not, that I will elude God, or that I will escape from God, and that my general attitude, my attitude towards my sins, is that I regret them despite my weakness and inability to stop them. And the Prophet ﷺ tells them, basically, I don't remember exactly what the exact words, but he tells them that not to worry, that Allah Ghafurur Rahim, that Allah is most forgiving. I mean, which goes back to the point that I was making, that if it's Allah knows your intentions, and the statement about shirk is not telling you that if you succumb to your ego, then you are a mushrik and you're lost. But it is what is your attitude towards your weakness, even before your ego or any other master other than God. What ayah did we stop at now?
We just did 116 to 119.
Okay. So there's one yeah. Next halaqah, inshallah, we will start with 123, because from 119 to 123 or 122, there's nothing for me to say. The meaning is plain. So 123, we start with 123. Before we disband I just remembered Rami during the breaks made a really good point that when the the when it came to the issue of prayer and um, rules for prayer, and then there are all these sort of special accommodations for exceptional circumstance and for conditions of fear and conditions of anxiety and so on. And then right after that, it talks about the rights of human beings, the reforms, the entitlements that people were due, and the fact that those who were refusing to give people their rights and their dues, uh, it basically comes and says no excuses. All your excuses are invalid, and that this correlates very much in usul al-fiqh to huququllah, the rights of God versus the rights of people. That when it comes to the rights of God, exigent circumstances are accommodated. When it comes to the rights of people, we are far less willing to recognize exigent circumstance because and and this again it validates the people who I believe that the invention of the field of usul al-fiqh was deeply saturated by Quranic ethics. I mean, these are people who basically absorb the Quran and then, to the best of their ability, within the systems of knowledge at their time, they try to give effect to the ethics of the Quran through a science of jurisprudence. Anyway, I thought it was a really interesting point, so I thought I should share it. Okay, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So we stopped at 23:3. You want to come to do the honors of closure? Close the proceedings.
Okay, alhamdulillah, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, as always, for an amazing session. Just, digging deeper into so many of the themes, clearly, in terms of highlights, the idea of the external and internal disempowerment, and asking yourself if you're complicit in your own disempowerment or your own oppression, and addressing this issue of like how people so much so in especially in our modern times are so focused on the technical detail and then lose sight of the bigger picture. So understanding like when Surah Nisa is giving us examples, and getting to the verses about even like, okay, here's the microdynamic when you are at war and you're trying to pray, you can take turns praying, hold your weapons if you need to. It would be so, we know so many situations where people would tend to default to the technical rules. But the idea of like looking at these verses and understanding that God is telling you, okay, here's how you handle it, but be smart. Use your common sense. This is not about losing yourself in some dogmatic approach to adhering to, the technical details. You're serving a cause. There's a larger point to this. Don't throw out all the technical details. So it's not like, okay, now you're in hardship, so now just don't pray at all. But, to accommodate and again use your reason and your intellect, which is always so liberating. And then when things, and then aside from all of that, remember God always, whether you're standing, sitting, laying down. When things return to normal, go back to prayer as normal. And it's such a beautiful like display of just the range and the complexity with which God is expecting us to operate. It was beautiful when you were telling us, the idea of the pristine state of Iman is when you are feeling tranquility and serenity and feeling really fulfilled with the remembrance of God. And we know from what we've been learning is that this road, if you decide that you're going to migrate to the path of God, that it is going to be a lonely and very difficult path. But the idea that even this loneliness can become a source of pleasure if you know that you're in the company of God and that God is with you, and that the ease comes with God despite the difficulty of the loneliness, and the difficulty. And then the verse 104, and reminding you that in your jihad you have what others don't, what your enemies don't, which is, you know, that you have Allah with you. So, and then it was really so valuable to go through all the different variations of resistance, the human resistance to what the Prophet is telling us, what God is telling us, what the Quran is directing us to do, and all the different ways that human beings can come up with justifications for not doing what's right. And just, like, these are just examples that are so powerful. We can think of people today that, Muslims who are Muslims by label, but not necessarily by action, and all the different justifications for why they're not doing what we all know is the right thing, even though it's more difficult. And being reminded that this is a message of truth and principle, and that's what should be driving your action. Verse 106 about always being in a state of forgiveness as a matter of pattern and practice, being reminded to sort of rise above these, all of these things that frustrated the Prophet about people not wanting to do what they should be doing, and then on the other side of things, people being frustrated that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was not taking a more vigilant stand. And again, underscored the whole idea of that balance. We're not here to make enemies. We're here to follow the path of truth. And it's like that, navigating that middle part. That ultimately Allah knows the truth of what people are doing and saying, the truth of their actions and their intentions. And then asking yourself, who do you want to be allied with? You're defending these people now that, making excuses for, maybe your relatives or all the reasons why they, should be okay, that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. But when it comes down to it, as you said, the Prophet told us, you will be with who you love. And, what do you want your status to be in the hereafter? Are you going to be defending these people in the hereafter in the same way that you're defending these people right now? And even, like the typical thing that people do of blaming others as an excuse for not doing what they should be doing, what the Quran commands. So ultimately, the bigger picture message is that, these are all moral failures. When you are resisting what you should be doing, you're being wishy-washy, you're defending or appeasing what, people are trying to get out of doing. And that there should be no accommodation for political pragmatism or appeasement, and that this is about holding steadfast to a moral program and a cause, and it's a cause of wisdom and revelation. And very powerful, the part where God is saying, well, what should we talk about? Like, don't, most of what this chatter behind the Prophet's back is not good, but what should we be talking about? Well, you should check yourself. You should be talking about acting in charity, doing good, bringing people together, removing enmity among people, and then ultimately asking, what are you attached to or wedded to or allied to? Is it God or your ego or something else? It comes down to, are you committed to struggle and sacrifice, or are you about excuses and apologetics? And the very scary idea that, when you are even Muslim by label, but you're choosing a very different path than the path of the Prophet Muhammad, then Allah could leave you to that path, or basically abandon you to yourself. So, the question of, are you pursuing reason and revelation, or are you pursuing your impulses and using reason to defend whatever it is that you want? So these are such, powerful questions, again, to just underscore all the same themes you've been talking about. Truth, Allah knows what's within you, and, choosing the path despite the difficulty and the challenges, and so much more, of course. But thank you so much. This has been incredible.
Brian, thank you for the books. I'm so grateful.
Thank you, everybody, for.
Brian sent me books. Anyone that sends me books becomes my hero for the rest of life.
He didn't even just send them; he brought them from overseas,
Yeah,
right, and then
yeah.
sent them to you from here. So that's like extra.
That's
It's
definitely
like
extra.
He hauled it in his luggage. So, alhamdulillah, extra blessings. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, and have a wonderful week. We're so excited and look forward to next week, inshallah. Actually, so we'll have two events, inshallah, next week. The halakha, well, no, three. Okay, so khutbah Friday, halakha Saturday, and then, inshallah, the Q&A event on Sunday, inshallah. So have a wonderful week, and we'll see you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.